Hello, everybody. It's so great to be here. Good afternoon. And I want to keep the slide portion pretty short because there are so many dietary supplements out there, like more than I can even talk about. And full disclosure, I don't know about all of them. So you might ask me a question and I might have to say, I don't know, or I can look that up. I just want to clarify what is a dietary supplement. So in general, a dietary supplement is something that people use that is above what is recommended total daily intake. For example, for vitamin D, the upper tolerable intake or the highest level for adults is 4,000 international units a day. And a lot of people take 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. So that would be kind of in the realm of dietary supplement use that is higher than what's recommended or higher in foods. There are vitamins and minerals. We have herbs or botanicals, excluding tobacco. There's amino acids, there's enzymes, there's glandulars. So glandulars, for example, a lot of people who have hypothyroid use a glandular pork thyroid hormone instead of the conventional synthetic. Then we have concentrates. So you can eat fish and get the good oils, but we also have fish oils in capsules, in liquid. We have metabolites of different plants. For example, indole 3-carbinol is from broccoli and is used for anti-inflammatory use. We have different constituents, like in green tea, L-theanine is pulled out of the green tea and is often used for anxiety or improving mood. And then we have extracts, so liquid herbal extracts that can come in extracted from water, sometimes alcohol, and sometimes glycerol, which is kind of a kind of sweet extract. Next slide. So I think you all know, and I'm assuming that many of you here, and you can put in the chat box if you do use any kind of dietary supplement. I'm just going to make the assumption that it's a yes for everyone here, but it's often a yes for the general public. So 60 to 80% of adults use a dietary supplement. And in the latest national survey, the top 3 most used are multivitamins and minerals, vitamin D, and omega-3 as fish oils. So I think it's interesting that in MS, when you look at recent surveys, it's pretty much the same. Vitamin D comes up first, fatty acids, which are a mix of omega-3s and omega-6s, multivitamin, and then calcium is the 4th. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about vitamin D, and then I'll talk about some other dietary supplements, like a selected list briefly. And then I'd like to open this up into a discussion so we can talk about some other supplements that people are taking. So what is vitamin D? It's a fat-soluble vitamin. You get it from sunlight. You can get it from foods. You can take a vitamin D supplement. It's most important in bone health. So it regulates calcium absorption in the body, and it's needed for bone health. So you use it for building bones. But it's also anti-inflammatory, and there's a lot of functions where it regulates the immune system. And this is where, people have looked at the immune effects or immunomodulatory effects of vitamin D and MS. Next slide. So I just wanted to put this up. This is the tolerable upper intake levels, and I had already mentioned this. This is from infants to adults, but for adults it's 4,000 IU, and I think many people in the wintertime, especially here in Portland where it's kind of gray in the winter, a lot of people go above 4,000 IUs per day. Next slide. So I also wanted to point out that there are dietary sources of vitamin D. Cod liver oil actually has quite a bit of vitamin D, 1,400 IUs per 1 tablespoon. Salmon, you know, a 3-ounce serving, which is like the size of the palm of your hand, has 360 IUs per serving. Tuna. And then if you go on down, I just want to point out that there are vitamin D fortified in milk and cereals, and that often sounds great, but you can see that the levels are quite low, 98, 40, very small amount in eggs. Next slide. So one thing we do need to look out for, vitamin D, again, is fat soluble. So that means that instead of the water soluble vitamins like vitamin C or the B vitamins that, that you are easily passed through the system, vitamin D actually can store in fat. And so because of that, if you take a lot of vitamin D, there's a chance of getting hypercalcemia, which means that high vitamin D levels will leach calcium from your bones. So it's like counterintuitive because it helps with bones, but at a very high level, it will leach the bones. And hypercalcemia is what causes, or that means that you have a lot of calcium in your blood, and we can test for that. But the symptoms would be nausea, headaches, muscle weakness, vomiting, excessive thirst or feeling thirsty a lot, pain, and urinating a lot. And this can lead to kidney stones. So I think that if you have any of these symptoms, or if you're taking above 4,000 IU of vitamin D per day, it's good to, one, you can check your vitamin D levels through your physician. And two, if you have these symptoms, I would definitely ask your physician to look at your calcium, blood calcium levels. Next slide. So for evidence of vitamin D, I'm just going to start with, this is not MS people, but this has come up with COVID-19. Low vitamin D levels have been associated with increased risk of COVID-19. I think early in COVID, before we had vaccines, people, I think, who were low in vitamin D, it was important to bring their levels up to normal. I think now that we have vaccines, it's still a good idea. Vitamin D is immunomodulatory, so it may help bolster the immune system with COVID-19 around, but now we have vaccines, so that's a big plus. And in people without MS, there is fairly good evidence that it improves depression. So for those two things, there is good evidence for vitamin D. Next slide. So in MS, there's some evidence that suggests that low vitamin D levels may lead to increased risk of MS. So that's people who don't have MS yet. If their levels are low, when they look at population studies, they see that those people with low levels have a higher risk of getting MS than those whose levels were in a normal or good range. The evidence right now is unclear if vitamin D supplementation improves MS symptoms. So we're still waiting for kind of a more solid clinical trial evidence
do anything.
To see if, we can get some more solid information on dose of vitamin D and what exactly it improves for MS symptoms. Next slide. Just some potential medication interactions with vitamin D. So if you take a statin or cholesterol lowering medications, those medications actually might decrease vitamin D levels. So if you're on a statin, sometimes it's a good idea to check your vitamin D levels and make sure they're in the normal range. Again, a lot of these are, if you're on this medication, it may deplete vitamin D levels. So corticosteroids, thiazide diuretics used oftentimes for hypertension. Actually, that one is the opposite. It can cause higher vitamin D levels. So if you're taking high levels of vitamin D, you might want to also check. orlistat decreases vitamin D levels, and anti-seizure medications, and topiramate is used for migraines, may deplete vitamin D levels. Next slide. So now I'm just gonna kind of go through this list quickly, just kind of touch base, and I'm gonna focus on clinical trials or human trials in MS. And then we can open it up to discussion. So the first thing I want to address is, how do you choose a dietary supplement? I get this question all the time. I get this question from patients. We're doing an integrative medicine rotation for residents right now, and the residents always ask, about this. And the answer is not that simple. It's a bit tricky. So dietary supplements are not regulated by the FDA, which means that there can be, you can buy a supplement and it can say that it has 2,000 IUs of vitamin D on it, but there's no standard of regulatory check on that label claim. So the best we can do is a few things. I put in the resources that we do have. There are some independent nonprofit labs that check for what's good manufacturing practice, which means that there's some regulation around the dietary supplement that to the highest standard, there's an independent check on the label claim. So if there's 2,000, if they say there's 2,000 IUs of vitamin D3 in the capsule, an independent lab check that, and there is, within a 10% plus or minus. They also check for like anything that might be harmful, for example, in fish oils, because we're getting the fish oils from fatty fish. Sometimes there's heavy metal contamination. Sometimes there's other toxins that would be in plants or other materials that are used to make the supplement. And a good dietary supplement will check for these things. So I think in your resources, I put a couple links to places that have lists of either companies or products. You can type in the name that have GMP or USP certified. And I think it's like, if you're questioning what the supplements you have, you can look in that list. Now, having said that, these are different independent nonprofit companies that I put in your links, and it's not going to cover everything. So they're not all inclusive. So your supplement may be GMP or it may be USP, but it may not be on one of these links. So what you can do, if you don't find it, is you can call the company or email the company and ask them, are you USP certified? Are you GMP certified? And they need to answer you. So they can tell you yes or no. Most companies, if they are, will answer yes right away. I think if you don't get an answer, I would look for another supplement that is on the list of, products that are USP or GMP certified. So we can talk more about that in the chat, but I just want to point that out. And the other thing I want to point out is the FDA it creates the certification standards, but it doesn't certify the companies. So it's these independent nonprofit groups that I put in the resource links that actually are doing the independent checking. The FDA only steps in if there are complaints. So if someone has an adverse event and they report it to the FDA, and say the FDA is seeing that company B, fish oil, is getting all these complaints of adverse events, then they will step in and check out the company. But that's, that only happens if people report. So omega-3 fatty acids, I do a lot of research in omega-3s. I've done a lot of research in omega-3s in MS. I would say that omega-3s for MS it's kind of like, if you look at the scientific evidence, it's on the border. It's not in the solid, like, yes, you should use it, but there are some clinical trials that kind of support its use. I would say that omega-3 fatty acids are considered by the FDA generally regarded as safe or GRAS if the EPA and DHA content is 3 grams or less. So you can find that out on the label, whatever omega-3 you're taking. You can kind of like do the math and figure out if you're in that GRAS category. So anywhere 3 grams and below, you're probably in a good range. Omega-3s are very anti-inflammatory. I did a study many years ago, a small open label that showed, that it decreased MMP9, which is an inflammatory marker that some of the interferon, MS interferon conventional medications work through decreasing those. Omega-3s can too. The main side effect, and this would be more if you're going above 3 grams per day, would be increasing bleeding time. So especially if you're on an anticoagulant, you may want to pay attention to that. If you're on an anticoagulant, you're already probably being tested by a PT-INR or looking at bleeding time. And so if those end up changing, your bleeding time starts decreasing, then, you may want to cut back on the omega-3 fatty acids. So I think that would be the main side effect. Other side effects include GI upset. When we run clinical trials, we were very careful about minimizing fish burps. So that happens. And actually, I think it was an MS patient told me the way they decreased the fish burps was to keep their omega-3s in the freezer, which is a good idea because fatty acids oxidize very quickly. And then if they're frozen, somehow it decreased. So you might want to try that if that's a problem. For antioxidants, so I'm going to focus on first vitamin C. There are no clinical trials that support vitamin C for MS, but having said that, it doesn't mean you can't take vitamin C. I would just say that if you take vitamin C, I would say a reasonable level would be, 100, 200 milligrams, not anything high, knowing that it's really not, there's no evidence right now for taking vitamin C for MS. Lipoic acid, though, there is some evidence, and I do want to talk about alpha lipoic acid. So Dr. Spain, Dr. Yadav at OHSU, where I'm at, have been doing a lot of studies for alpha lipoic acid in MS. Currently, Dr. Spain is doing a study that's looking at progressive forms of MS with 1,200 milligrams per day of alpha lipoic acid. So far, what we see in the studies is that it is anti-inflammatory. There may be some in a sub-analysis of one of Dr. Spain's studies at 1,200 milligrams in progressive forms. There's some small evidence that suggests that after a year of supplementation, that it may slightly improve gait, which is good. But we're still in that zone of trying to figure out if lipoic acid is helpful in MS. So right now, we don't really know. I also want to point out that alpha lipoic acid comes in 2 forms. The natural form is the R form, and you'll see R lipoic acid, on the shelves over the counter. The R form is the form that's found in food. It's the form that your body can assimilate well. The RS form, so if it doesn't say R on the label, then it's the RS form, or this mixed form of lipoic acid. And the S part, and usually what happens is the mix is about 50-50, because when they produce alpha lipoic acid for the supplement, 50% of it is the active form and 50% becomes this sort of inactive lipoic acid form that your body can't assimilate well. And it's too hard, or it will be, I think it's more of a cost issue. Like to pull the S part out just takes an extra step, costs a little more. That's why our lipoic is more expensive. So oftentimes they just leave it in. Again, there was a study done at OHSU comparing the absorption of the R form with this RS form, and the R form does assimilate better. When you do the same dose of R lipoic and RS lipoic, you get higher levels of R lipoic in blood. So I recommend, actually for my patients, I always recommend the R form because we can use a lower dose. The other thing I want to point out is, and this is also a study, it's kind of a little sciencey that I put in your resources for this talk, is that the studies that are ongoing now in progressive forms of MS, the multi-center studies are using the mixed form at 1,200 milligrams per day. And in doing those studies, there's a lot of safety checks. So one thing that came up where there were some cases of folks in that study, just a few, who were showing increased protein in urinalysis. And then there were some reports from people not in the study and some people not having MS. So this is like a case series. But from that case series, it was identified that there might be some association with this RS form of lipoic acid and this very specific inflammatory kidney condition that is transient. Once identified, if you're having a lot of protein in your urine, which we can check. So I've been checking all my MS patients who are taking 600 to 1,200 or even higher alpha lipoic acid, R or S forms, just to make sure they're not spilling protein. So if you're taking alpha lipoic acid, you might want to talk to your neurologist or your primary care just to be sure. The symptoms of this inflammatory kidney condition are edema. So you can have edema in your face, limbs, frothy urine, excessive thirst. And some of the other symptoms are kind of like MS. So, like fatigue. But I would say that the edema would be the one that I would pay attention to the most. So far, I've looked at 5 of my patients and they are fine. They don't have any symptoms and they aren't spilling protein. But I just wanted to just mention that because it's a new finding and we're looking at that now. Biotin. So I'm just going to really cover the latest phase 3 trial in progressive forms of MS from Dr. Cree's publication. And so in the phase 3 trial, which was a fairly large trial, there was no difference between those receiving 100 milligrams of biotin 3 times a day or 300 milligrams a day, and the placebo group in EDSS. And I think another finding from that study was that biotin at those high levels actually affect a lot of labs. So they for sure affect if you have hypothyroid and you need your thyroid checked. They affect those labs. They affect hormone labs. They affect a number of labs. So if you are dosing biotin, I would say at 5 milligrams or 5,000 micrograms and higher, just be aware that if you're having any labs done, you might want to stop taking the biotin before you do the labs because it may skew your lab results. Biotin, though, in general is pretty safe. even at those high levels in the MS clinical trial. So the recommended amount is like 30 micrograms a day. And in the 300 milligrams per day clinical trial, that was like 10,000 times the daily recommended. And even at that dose, it was relatively safe. So I think the main take home about biotin is, if you're dosing 5 milligrams or higher and doing labs, just make sure you're off biotin before you get your blood drawn. And then for B vitamins, there wasn't really any, again, I look at clinical trials in MS because I feel those are the most relevant. That's the most relevant scientific evidence. And for B vitamins, I didn't see anything that would be supportive for MS. I feel B vitamins are best supplemented through diet. So in your resources, I also had a list of foods that were high in B vitamins, and a lot of them are whole grains. So they're very healthy foods, whole grains, nuts, things like that.